Imagine waking up in ancient Egypt. There's no alarm clock, no school bus, no office commute, no supermarket waiting downstairs. You open the door, step into the street, and your day begins. But what exactly happens next? Because when we picture ancient Egypt, we usually see pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, and temples. What we don't usually see is the ordinary day. Who made the bread? Who grew the grain? Who counted it? Who built the furniture? Who caught the fish? Who cleaned the house? And what did people actually do between sunrise and sunset? The answer is much more complicated than simply saying, they worked. Ancient Egypt was an agricultural society, and most of its population were peasant farmers. But alongside them were specialized workers, scribes, administrators, artisans, servants, priests, soldiers, and many others. So let's follow the day. Not the day of a pharaoh, the day of ordinary people. Morning for a farmer, the day could begin early. Before the worst heat arrived, there was work to do. Fields had to be cultivated, crops had to be harvested, animals had to be cared for, grain had to be moved and stored. And farming wasn't just about putting seeds into the ground. Once grain was harvested, it entered an entire chain of work. Someone transported it, someone measured it, someone stored it, and someone had to keep track of how much existed. That last job belonged to people you might not expect, scribes. A scribe wasn't simply someone drawing hieroglyphs on temple walls. Writing was a specialized profession, especially connected with administration, government, and temple management. Imagine a granary. Workers are carrying sacks of grain inside. But nearby, scribes are sitting with writing equipment, recording quantities. At one surviving model of a Middle Kingdom granary, the accounting work is actually emphasized. Men measure and record the grain while others carry it. So while one Egyptian is using his muscles, another is using numbers, and both are keeping the same economy running. Then comes breakfast. For many Egyptians, one of the most important foods was something incredibly simple, bread. But bread doesn't magically appear. Someone has to process the grain. Grain has to be crushed and ground into flour. The flour has to be worked into dough. Then the dough has to be shaped and baked. And bread production could happen alongside another major Egyptian staple, beer. Ancient Egyptian beer was produced through a process involving grain preparation and fermentation. We know this wasn't some minor activity. Models from the tomb of the official Mekhitra actually show different stages of bakery and brewery work, including grinding grain, preparing bread, and handling beer. So somewhere in the settlement, while farmers are working outside, people are already turning yesterday's harvest into today's food. But not everyone is working with grain. Walk into another part of the settlement and you'll find craftsmen. A carpenter works with wood, another worker shapes jewelry, someone else makes pottery. These aren't random hobbies. They're specialized skills. Ancient Egyptian tomb scenes and archaeological evidence preserve examples of carpentry, jewelry making, fishing, hunting, cattle work, food production, and other specialized activities. And specialization changes everything. A farmer doesn't need to know how to make every tool he uses. A carpenter doesn't need to grow all his own food. A scribe doesn't need to harvest every sack of grain he records. Instead, thousands of people perform different jobs, and their work connects. That's how a large civilization functions. And then there are the people moving everything. The Nile wasn't just somewhere Egyptians lived beside. It was a transportation route. Boats could carry people, crops, animals, and other goods along the river. That meant moving something didn't always require dragging it across desert roads. Load it onto a boat, and the river does much of the work. For a civilization stretched along the Nile Valley, that's enormously useful. What about women? This is where the idea of the average Egyptian day gets complicated. Women were not all doing one identical job. Households required constant work, preparing food, managing supplies, making or handling textiles, caring for children, and maintaining the household. But women could also appear in economic and professional contexts. The evidence doesn't support the idea that every Egyptian simply woke up and performed one fixed role until sunset. Life depended heavily on status, location, occupation, and period. A wealthy household could contain servants and specialized workers. A farming family had very different demands. A government official lived differently again. Social status affected people's access to resources, wealth, influence, and occupations. And what about children? Children didn't have the modern childhood schedule we recognize today. They grew up inside the household's work. They watched adults. They learned skills. They helped where needed. For someone who would eventually become a farmer, artisan, household worker, or another profession, everyday life itself could become training. And for the tiny percentage of Egyptians who learned to read and write, education could lead towards specialized scribal work. Literacy was not widespread. It was a professional advantage. Afternoon now, imagine the settlement several hours into the day. The farmer has been working. The baker has been producing food. The craftsmen are still working. The scribes are recording supplies. Animals need attention. Goods need moving. And somewhere, someone is probably fishing. Fishing and hunting weren't simply entertainment. They were also sources of food, and scenes showing fishing, hunting, cattle raising, harvesting, and food preparation appear repeatedly in Egyptian art. But here's an important detail. We shouldn't imagine every Egyptian doing all of these things every day. The evidence gives us different pieces of Egyptian life, not a single universal timetable. A tomb painting might show a particular activity because it represented something the tomb owner wanted preserved for the afterlife. Archaeology adds evidence from houses, tools, workshops, storage areas, and other remains. Together, these sources let historians reconstruct parts of daily life, but never every minute of an ordinary person's day. Evening. Eventually, the day's productive work slows down. Food has been prepared, animals have been dealt with, tools are put away, people return to their households. And now something we often forget about ancient people becomes important. They had free time. Ancient Egyptians weren't machines. They socialized. They enjoyed music. They played games. They attended festivals. They hunted, fished, and spent time with family. Wealthier households could have comfortable homes and gardens, while ordinary families lived much more modestly. And then there was religion. Religion wasn't necessarily something Egyptians did for 1 hour on a particular day. It was woven into their understanding of life, death, family, work, and the universe. Even the objects placed in tombs reveal how strongly Egyptians connected the afterlife with ordinary necessities: food, drink, clothing, shelter. The things people needed in life were imagined as things they would continue needing after death. So what did an Egyptian actually do all day? The answer depends on who you were. A farmer might spend the day dealing with fields and animals. A baker could spend hours processing grain and making bread. A brewer could turn grain into beer. A carpenter worked wood, a jeweler worked precious materials, a fisherman worked the river, a boatman moved people and goods, a scribe recorded information, a servant maintained a household, a priest handled temple duties, a government official managed people and resources, and a wealthy noble could have an entire estate filled with workers performing different specialized jobs. That is the part that makes ancient Egypt interesting. There wasn't one Egyptian lifestyle. There was an entire society with thousands of jobs connected by food, agriculture, transportation, administration, craftsmanship, family, and religion. The pyramids didn't build themselves. The temples didn't feed themselves. The armies didn't supply themselves. The government couldn't function without records. And cities couldn't survive without food. Behind every famous monument was a huge network of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs extraordinarily consistently. So the next time you see a pyramid, don't just imagine the pharaoh who ordered it. Imagine the farmer growing the grain, the worker carrying the materials, the scribe recording supplies, the baker making bread, the boatman moving goods along the Nile, the craftsman making tools, the family preparing dinner. Because that was ancient Egypt too. Not just kings, not just pyramids, not just mummies, but millions of small tasks, repeated day after day, until those ordinary routines became one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. And maybe that's the strangest thing about the ancient world. History remembers the monuments, but civilizations are actually built by people waking up, going to work, making food, solving problems, raising families, and doing it all again tomorrow. If you enjoyed this journey into everyday life in ancient Egypt, subscribe to The Ancient Egyptians for more stories about how ordinary people lived, worked, survived, and built one of history's greatest civilizations. And I'll see you in the next one.